Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Carrigan Martell. I'm a MyTax Accelerate research intern working on this project with Dr. Norine Verberg from St. FX University. We would like to acknowledge that St. FX is found in Mi'kma'ki on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples. Our project today is titled EAL and the Economic Transitions of Refugees Resettling in Rural Nova Scotia. Following the 2015 election, Canada resettled approximately 25,000 Syrian refugees over a 3-month period, in addition to refugees from other nations such as the DRC, Kenya, etc. Families arriving were primarily unilingual Arabic speakers, and today we will report on a study focused on the economic transitions of refugees who are resettled by community groups in rural Nova Scotia. A key finding of this research has been that access to English as an additional language, or further known as EAL courses, and gaining English literacy is essential to making meaningful and holistic economic transitions. Refugees resettled in Canada arrive as a very diverse population whose identities, backgrounds, and post-migration circumstances influence their economic transitions and future prospects. Refugees come with highly variable pre-migration education, occupations, and refugee circumstances. Many discover that their pre-migration careers end if their credentials are not recognized or if their language proficiency is poor. Visible minority newcomers and those belonging to minority religious or cultural communities report experiencing prejudice and discrimination as well. Women newcomers often, quote, feel pushed into low-waged, low-skill, precarious, and feminized positions. How refugee newcomers fare also depends on the economic circumstances at the time of their arrival, as well as their admission pathway and where they resettle. Our study addresses these last two variables with special consideration to refugees who are resettled by community sponsors in rural areas. In Canada, refugees are sponsored through 2 different pathways, with each providing 12 months of settlement assistance. The vast majority are settled through the Government Assisted Refugees, or GAR program, and receive resettlement assistance from nonprofit service provider organizations. Those coming through the private sponsorship of refugees program receive resettlement assistance from community volunteers, and they may avail themselves of any relevant services available within the community. Sponsorship has been taken up by faith groups, community groups, ethnic organizations, groups of individuals, and sponsorship agreement holders within rural areas. Within the private sponsorship stream, or community sponsorship stream, a refugee may be identified or named by the sponsorship group, or since 2013, a group can use the federal cost-sharing blended visa office referral program if they sponsor a refugee identified as highly vulnerable by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. While the community sponsorship program has been in place since 1979, there is very limited literature on this PSR program or comparing the 2 resettlement pathways. There is even less research comparing the economic transition of GARs, PSR, named refugees, and PSR BVORs, although some multivariate studies have shed some light on this. A good deal of research provides support for the hypothesis that PSR newcomers have better economic outcomes. Kaida and her colleagues explored economic integration of newcomers over time and found that compared to GAR situations, community-sponsored refugees are more likely to be employed and earn more up to 15 years after arrival. Over the long term, the community-sponsored advantage is more pronounced for less educated refugees. However, it diminishes quickly for more educated refugees. As well, the private sponsorship refugees who know English and/or French have a long-term integration advantage over those who do not. Through their work, Kaida et al. Have been able to explain the community sponsorship advantage. Why this happens has been explained in a couple of ways. First, PSR newcomers are hypothesized to have better short and long-term economic integration as measured by holding employment and level of income. This is explained in a few ways. First, research suggests that community-sponsored newcomers are more likely to arrive with socioeconomic and contextual advantages. For example, they may be more educated, speak an official language, or have had a less vulnerable refugee background. This is likely reflected in the backgrounds of named newcomers. Whether this describes the BVOR situation for newcomers is not clear. Secondly, community-sponsored group members provide one-on-one social bridging capital that facilitates newcomers' information literacy. Finally, admission pathways have been identified as influencing whether one is resettled in a large or small city or in a rural area. Population size is considered an economic issue for all Canadians, not just immigrants and newcomers. How this impacts refugee newcomers is only beginning to receive attention. For example, in Nova Scotia, all government-assisted refugees are resettled in Halifax, which is our only city. Their resettlement assistance happens on behalf of ISANS, which is the Immigrant Services Association of Nova Scotia. All resettlement in rural areas happens when community groups decide to sponsor refugees, and so these community groups are then responsible for that resettlement assistance, including housing, healthcare, and those EAL courses, which are so key. During Operation Syria, approximately 20% of all BVORs resettled in Canada were sponsored by these rural community groups in Nova Scotia. These sponsorship groups were formed in nearly all rural counties from 2015 to 2016 as a response to the need for Operation Syria. So here we have a snapshot of the geography of rural resettlement in Cape Breton throughout Operation Syria. 11 communities within this end of the province, mostly in rural small towns, sponsored 14 BVOR Syrian refugee families. So these are people who are coming from particularly vulnerable situations, and they're coming here based on need. So 11 families remain within Cape Breton, plus more have come due to family reunification. Rural small city resettlement happened all across of Nova Scotia and Canada in very similar patterns. This project was conducted as a qualitative study of the economic transitions of blended visa office referral refugee newcomers being resettled in rural Nova Scotia. So these are individuals coming from particularly vulnerable situations where they're being brought over based on need. We conducted interviews with newcomers and volunteers from 11 sponsorship groups in 6 rural counties, namely Kings County, Lunenburg, Guysborough, Pictou, Antigonish, and Inverness. Our study sample includes 11 resettlement groups that sponsored and resettled 46 blended visa office referral families and 3 government-assisted refugee families. 7 of the groups we spoke with continue to wait for other families to arrive. The most salient area of concern for newcomers and volunteers alike was language and language acquisition. So group members noted that they had no prior experience with resettlement and said that they went on significant learning curves to innovate and provide the services that were required. The volunteers received only very basic information about sponsored families regarding family size, age and gender, if a serious health issue was identified, and the country of origin. They knew nothing about newcomers' English language ability, whether they had literacy in any language or any level of formal education. A quote from a volunteer, "We were told one person spoke English. He could say hi." So the very core theme of our project has become language, and namely language proficiency and how it impacts every single aspect of getting work. And so certain English levels are required for getting a driver's license, getting safety certificates, developing a resume, applying for jobs, doing the job interviews in person, understanding instructions at work, and having their previous credentials recognized. Through their resettlement work, volunteers came to realize how seriously they needed to innovate to develop the necessary programs and had to adjust to 4 very salient points. One being the diversity of EAL readiness, how significantly language impacts getting meaningful work, the language that has to be prioritized in resettlement and how to do so, and that month 13, after that first 12-month official period of resettlement, looks very, very different for disadvantaged newcomers. When it comes to the diversity of EAL readiness, some newcomers and volunteers noted how low or non-existent the literacy was in the first language. A quote from a volunteer, "Literacy is really important. It's very difficult to acquire literacy in a second language if you're not literate in your first language." Other newcomers came with high school or post-secondary education, some even with multiple degrees, but few knew the Roman alphabet or even the complete Arabic alphabet. This is why EAL needs to be tailored to address these differences. Secondly, there is a very key importance in language proficiency for employment because learning English as a basic language is very different from the language used in the workplace. To quote, "But the other biggest challenge is language ability, so if they come with limited language, then the job opportunities are very limited." Another said, "Language is going to make a difference between him getting a minimum wage job that he'll never be able to move out of or a different type of opportunity." Many groups supported the newcomers' need to start work and came to realize that language proficiency has to be prioritized. To quote, "It is very easy for somebody to go from a language level 0 to English level 3, and it's really hard to go from a 4 to an 8. But in terms of getting those higher level types of positions or working more directly in your field, you have to be very intentional about the language piece." Secondly, they were really pushed to learn English, so attending EAL every day was really important. And the women did that, but the men kind of petered out a bit because they were anxious to get jobs. So many newcomers feel this intense pressure to work, missing EAL, noted by many volunteers. Yet for many, it became clear that for the first year at least, quote, "language learning is their job." Lastly, we were visiting Syria newcomers last week, and I told them that we were going to be talking to you. And I asked if they had anything that they would like to say about what made it easy or difficult for them to find employment. The thing they said was that definitely language. It was the biggest barrier. And they said that their friends who had emigrated to Germany, that they were actually given 3 years of financial support to learn German. They actually are not allowed to work for 3 years. They have to go to school. Many volunteers feel that we must measure the success of a newcomer based on one's starting point. So groups sponsoring significantly disadvantaged refugees maintain their supportive relationships well beyond year 1 and continue those interpersonal relationships because in these rural areas, not only are you resettling this refugee, but you're welcoming a new neighbor. To quote, "And for me, there's a lot of reasons why somebody might not be employed at the end of that year. A year also is not actually a very long time to adapt to a whole new culture and learn a whole new language and, pick up new skills where you need them." All of those people came with different tools in their tool belt to begin with, and so some of them had less tools, and if you don't have any language skills and you've never finished your high school in your first language, you have less tools. So it's going to take you longer to put the tools in that you need to be successful. And lastly, from a newcomer, and this is something like, imagine if I can take you and pick you up and throw you away in Syria or somewhere, or in China, right? And you try to learn Chinese, get to know their laws, their money. It's just too much for you in 1 year, right? And there's also stress, it's stress. So you think, what is my first year going to be like? How am I going to manage in a foreign country to imagine my life and survival? Succeed with my dreams and goals. So it is tough. To conclude, there are several generalizations that were able to be drawn from interviews with community sponsors throughout their journeys in rural refugee resettlement, as well as from the experiences of the newcomers themselves. Both groups identified resettlement policies as lacking when it comes to informing, directing, and educating the community sponsorship groups regarding language transitions and how to accomplish them successfully. The key policy recommendations to be drawn are that EAL must be both structured and prioritized in resettlement. Some even suggest implementing a 6-month mandate to language learning before attempting to find employment. Lastly, we must think very critically of the 1-year-fits-all policy structure. Finally, I would like to thank our community partners throughout this project, which have been Syria Antigonish Families Embrace and Pictou County Safe Harbor, as well as the University Council for Research at St. FX University, and MyTax for funding this research. And thank you so much for listening. I look forward to a lively discussion come September.